I'd like to introduce Steve McShane, who has done so much for us. Steve is the director of the Calumet Regional Archives at Indiana University Northwest. And Steve, if you can come up. Thanks.
Thanks again. Thank you, Mark. Morning, everyone. Good to see you. Thanks for coming out today. I've learned over the years that short intros are most welcome, and that's what I'll try and do. But I am delighted to have our keynote speaker today, and I think we're going to hear some very, very interesting findings from him. Stephen Paul O'Hara is an assistant professor of history at Xavier University in Cincinnati. And he tells me that his road trip last night was amazingly, virtually free of construction. Which is something we should probably note in the historical record. Paul has been very busy in terms of his research. He began by earning his BA in history, summa cum laude, from the University of Minnesota. And then he earned his PhD in history from IU Bloomington. And so I must say, go Big Red, Paul. Or maybe I shouldn't say that here, right? Okay, I'll move on. Yes. Paul has been researching particularly the steel city of Gary over the past 10 years or so, and has published numerous articles and pieces about industrial history, cultural history, all sorts of aspects of our industrial and cultural heritage. He's actually going to have a wonderful book come out this January called Gary, the Most American of All American Cities, and he will join a number of scholars who have written on this city, but also he will bring us some new information and a unique and different perspective on the steel city's history. So it is my great pleasure and delight to introduce to you Dr. Paul O'Hara from Xavier University. Paul.
My thanks to Steve McShane and to all the other planners and organizers of this conference. It is my great pleasure to be here. I greatly appreciate that you moved it as close to Cincinnati as you possibly could, all the shorter. And I should point out, Steve, as well, that I'm now contractually obligated to talk about Xavier basketball, which may be even less popular here. I'm particularly pleased to talk to a group such as this one. Interested in the Calumet region, interested in the history, the heritage, preservation, but also interested in working across boundaries, right? Working not only that state boundary, but also different kinds of organizations, historical, educational, community activist, all these other voices that we rarely ever hear from. Right? It's a great conversation to have, so I'm particularly pleased to be a part of it. Richard Florida, in a quickly notorious article written in the March 2009 issue of The Atlantic, offered his predictions of what the American economy and what American cities would look like after the crash. Florida, who had long been famous / infamous for its advocation of what he called the creative class, or that cities needed to reinvent themselves as vibrant centers for young professionals and art and culture. After the crash, he said in the article, some cities would win, some cities would lose. Those that had what he called talent clustering and a fast urban metabolism meaning ideas, new ideas moved quickly to fruition, these would thrive, these would survive, others would fail. Urbanism, it seemed, had become a zero-sum game. Some would win, some would lose. Not surprisingly, Florida's prediction of the future looked a lot like what he had long been preaching. Right? Like most of us, he pretty much assumed that what was happening proved that he was right. Yet he also changed a very important part of what he had long been advocating. Because Florida had gone on speaking tours, telling cities, particularly post-industrial cities, that they could reinvent themselves, that they could thrive, that they could reinvent themselves as these new creative class environments. Suddenly, it seemed, in 2008, that was no longer possible. Some cities would win, some cities would lose. Indeed, he said it was foolish to try to save some of these cities, some of them that had been too far gone. Finally, we need to be clear, he said, that ultimately we can't stop the decline of some places, and we'd be foolish to try. Instead, we need to help faltering cities manage their decline better. Not surprisingly, this led to very quick criticism, particularly from those cities that had paid Florida to come and tell them how to revitalize. Can't. But it also points to a larger issue. The concept, the phrase, the term post-industrial that often gets thrown around in discussions of cities and economies and regions. And the notion of the post-industrial is problematic in two particular ways. The first is that it assumes that industrial production no longer happens. And that is clearly not true. The second is that it assumes a kind of linear, natural movement. That we had moved from an industrial age to a post-industrial age. And those spaces that had been part of that industrial age, time had passed them by, that they were now relegated to the dustbin of history. Of course, such definitions are particularly problematic for industrial cities, especially those cities that had suffered the loss of plants, of factories, of industrial jobs, cities that were still quite de-industrial, if not yet post-industrial. The assumption of the post-industrial also is problematic, but intriguing for folk like us, for a society such as yours. People who are interested in the heritage, the history, the meaning of industrial spaces. How do we make the argument that these places not only matter, but still matter? That the history matters, that the heritage matters, that the Calumet Region still matters. So one way to think about this, one idea that I had for today, is to think about intersections. That conversation between different disciplines, different people, different approaches, particularly the intersections of history and of heritage and of folklore, which overlap in many important ways. But just as a quick kind of definition, we might think about history as the discipline that looks for social and political context, and for explanation, for larger trends. Folklore as the study of culture, of the stories people tell, of the language they use, of the assumptions that go into these stories. And of heritage, the physical objects, the places themselves, both the things you can hold in your hand, but also the buildings, the sites. How do those three combine? Where do they intersect? And why should they intersect? So as one of the ways to approach this, let me use Gary as an example. And I use Gary as an example because, A, it's what I know, and thus it gives me something to talk about. But also, it's a place to start, right? We can use Gary as an example. Use Gary to illuminate all three of these. It both helps us to think about the Calumet region in general. Gary can stand in as an example for the rest of the Calumet, yet at the same time we can also think about the ways in which Gary doesn't stand in for the rest of the Calumet. Right? To recognize not only the national, the regional, but also the local, and embrace those variances, those complexities, those differences between those three. I should also warn you before I delve further into this, the one that I embrace the most, the one that I study, tends to be industrial folklore. Right? So the ways in which stories are told, in particular, the way in which the nation talks of, thinks about Gary. Right? Stories told about Gary. Which means, you know, I study the way people talk. I study the words people use. Which means, you know, the 3 or 4 different people who asked me this morning if I had any AV to put up on the board. I said, I don't. I mean, I don't really have cool maps and dots and all this other fun stuff that help keep you awake. I have words. But hopefully, the point here is that the words matter. That understanding the words. Understanding what words people choose to use matters. So when we think about Gary, the residents of Gary, and certainly the rest of the nation throughout much of the 20th century, would have been surprised by Florida's declaration that this is a place that didn't matter. Because throughout the 20th century, Gary mattered. People watched. People paid attention. People talked about Gary. From its very inception, right, built by U.S. Steel, from 1906 to 1909, building a massive steel-producing center and the corresponding town. Right, from that very origin, to the American imagination and to the American public, Gary mattered. It was, in the words of many, the magic city. It was Steel's greatest accomplishment. It was the shrine of the steel god. It was industrial utopia. Other observers less glowing in their critiques. But still, right, Gary mattered. It was a crucible of humanity. It was a microcosm of all American cities. It was the very model of urban decay. It was, as one observer argued, the most American of all American cities.